This video will take you through the first few pages of the Introduction to Shakespeare packet. And at the very beginning, there's a diagnostic test, which you should first just try on your own without looking at anything. How many of the questions are you able to answer? Then, any of the ones that are unable to answer, you should Google, fill them all in, and then check them over on the next few slides. So, first, Shakespeare's first name is William. Easy one, I hope. Second, where is he from? England, specifically. The town is called Stratford-upon-Avon. And of course, remember that England is part of Great Britain. The time period he wrote, 1500s and 1600s, which were part of the Renaissance, meaning rebirth, which began in Italy and spread throughout Europe, and was basically rediscovering all of the art and literature, philosophy, and so on from the Greeks and the Romans, which had been lost during the Middle Ages. As for what he wrote, mainly plays, also known as dramas. He did write sonnets as well, a few other things, but mainly known for his plays. Most famous Shakespeare plays, arguably, Othello. We'll talk about these later on during the notes on Shakespeare's life. Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, Henry V, Macbeth, often referred to only as the Scottish play, The Tragedy of Julius Caesar, A Midsummer Night's Dream. There are many others we'll talk about when we get to Shakespeare's life. Some of the more famous ones are there. Who was queen during most of his life, Queen Elizabeth. Quite an impressive reign. We'll go over in a few pages. And then when she died, King James took over. They were both pretty big patrons of the arts and loved drama, which is why probably Shakespeare was able to write it all. Had there been people who were not as open to that, we might not have his writings today. Of course, King James commissioned the first English Bible, the first English version where he had it translated, and that's called the King James Bible. And if you know some of the traditional quotes from the Bible, like "thou shalt not kill," I mean, think about the language there. That's from this time period. That's going to be very similar to Elizabethan English, Shakespearean English in general. And we have some familiarity with words like thou and thee and thy because of the King James Bible and other texts from the period. But this was just the first one translated into English. There have been many others since then. And the story of Romeo and Juliet, although Shakespeare is from England, of course, it takes place in Verona, Italy. And in general, during the Renaissance, the British and others in Northern Europe were kind of obsessed with Italy because that's where it began, and because that's where many of the classical architecture and art and everything was. And so the objectives for the rest of this packet is to be able to explain why Shakespeare wrote in a very different version of English than what we speak today, to also understand the history of the English language and that it is changing, ever-changing, Shakespeare's profound impact on the English language, coining many words, and of course, many titles of books and so on come out of some of his lines. And then finally, to translate the most common archaic, meaning dead, Elizabethan words that we simply don't use anymore. And so, when it comes to understanding Shakespeare, often he's placed on a pedestal that a lot of people feel like they cannot rise to, they cannot understand. And people say, oh, Shakespeare, that's too difficult for me. I don't understand that. That's only for high society types or something like that. But there are a few myths associated with Shakespeare. The first is that he wrote in a more formal version of English. And so if you look at the lines here, which would be read by Juliet, O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? It sounds very formal. It sounds stuffy. It sounds like something that you would only have from like the upper class. But although the characters in the story are upper class, the plays were written for everybody. And it's not that it's more formal. It's just that we don't use these words anymore. I think you can imagine what O means today, just usually OH. And then wherefore, a lot of people might think that that's where are you, Romeo? But it's actually why. She's saying, why are you Romeo? Why can't you be somebody else? Why can't you have a different name so that maybe I'd be allowed to love you? Because in the story, they're not allowed to be together. And so, wherefore art thou means why are you? I think most of us know art and thou. But regardless, these were words that people just would have used at the time. The language has changed. And so, why did he write so differently? Why is a phrase like that so hard for us to understand without knowing how to translate the words? Now, first of all, the time period plays a major role, probably the biggest role. In fact, if you look at the history of the English language, you can see that Old English, well before Shakespeare's time, went on for hundreds of years. And I'll show a slide in a minute here. We really can't understand it at all. When we get to Middle English, we can understand a little bit, but if you see where Shakespeare is, that's like entering modern English. So even though it's pretty old to us and hard to understand, it's still technically modern English. And then you see how the language, instead of coming together from all these different influences from French, from Latin, and so on, when we get up to the 17th century or so, it starts to split into what we know, of course, American English, and then we have different versions of English throughout the world, as you can see there. And then you see the internet here, which might bring the languages back together because we're communicating across the world now in English. And so it might eventually cause the language to be very similar, whether you're in the US or Australia or wherever. If you look at the left side here, this is Old English. A couple words in there you might recognize. You can more or less recognize most of the letters, but it's pretty much unreadable. You look at the modern translation on the right there. There are some words that have similarities, but you wouldn't really be able to read this without it being translated into modern English. When we get to Middle English, it's a little bit more understandable. Famous works of literature like Beowulf or the Canterbury Tales are written in Middle English, and a lot of times they get translated as well. But if you were a scholar, you could learn the language and be able to read it the way it was written, but still pretty different. And then when we get to Elizabethan, I have a couple of things from the Bible here just because it's an easy way for us to understand it. You see Queen Elizabeth, look at her reign. Look how long she was queen. And also defeated the Spanish Armada during her time, did a lot of things for England that usually put her near the top of the list of best kings and queens of all time. King James also reigned for quite a while, and this was the time of the King James Bible and so on. And so if you look at the Psalms quote here, delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. And so words like thyself mean yourself, or down here, thee means you, or here, thine means your. And so we can understand it more or less. There are some words that are very difficult and some that are changed because there's no way for us to understand them. But the bulk of the words we can get, especially if we just learn some of the more common ones. Shakespeare coined many words. This list is very short compared to all the words. These are some of the more interesting ones, like skim milk and even a gust of something. And a lot of times he was just taking words and combining them with other words, but they're still the first time that they were mentioned in literature. And then a lot of kind of cliches today, like somebody dead as a doornail or vanished into thin air or somebody's tongue-tied. Those are all from Shakespeare too. A lot of titles of books and movies come from Shakespeare too, like The Fault in Our Stars, or which I believe comes from Julius Caesar, and The Winter of Our Discontent, a common phrase and title of a novel by John Steinbeck, and that's from Richard III, a play by Shakespeare. Second reason is location. That, of course, we use a lot of different words in the US than in England today. Now, this is a small thing because, of course, people were just beginning to settle the United States in the 15 and 1600s. And so the British version of English is what came over. But then American English kind of broke away from it. And so as a result, there are a lot of words that are in Shakespeare that British people might understand better than Americans. These aren't really the words, but it's just like an example of how a boot of a car, if you ever heard that before, in England, it's called that, but it's just the trunk. A lift is an elevator. Trainers are tennis shoes. A lorry is a truck. And so if people were to say these things to you, if you visited England or something, you wouldn't understand what they were talking about without asking, or if you've heard the words before. So that's somewhat of an issue as well. Reason 3 is that it's poetry, it's not prose. And so, for instance, when in the famous balcony scene, Romeo sees Juliet come to the window, he doesn't just say, I am happy that Juliet just came to the window. Instead, it's poetic. He says, it is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Of course, the sun rises in the east, and the sun can be symbolic of beauty and love and power and warmth. And so here his day is brightening, it's beginning, and it's because of Juliet. And so because it's metaphorical, it makes it a little bit challenging to read while you're also trying to deal with all the differences in the words. Right after that, he says, arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, rather than just saying, I hope the sun comes up and the moon leaves. Instead, this is personification, saying that the sun should kill the envious moon, and that the moon is envious of the sun because of the brightness it brings to the world. Reason 4 is the verse form, meaning that the way that it's written, oftentimes you have inverted syntax, is called, like just like a switch in the word order. And so rather than John caught the ball, it might be the ball John caught. Now, you might think that's just to sound clever or something like that, but it's also to keep the rhyme scheme the same if you need the rhyme to follow a pattern. Now, Shakespeare doesn't all rhyme. In fact, most of it doesn't. But if it was a rhyme couplet, which there are plenty of in Shakespeare, and we'll see in Romeo and Juliet, then caught might be the word that the line ends with, and it would rhyme with the last word in the next line. And so the word order gets switched so that it happens. But the other reason that this happens is for the rhythm, that Shakespeare was writing in this rhythm called iambic pentameter, and he was trying to keep a certain rhythmic sound, which everybody kind of wrote in back then, but that's why the words can be reversed as well. Again, that rhythm is called iambic pentameter, and every line is more or less 10 syllables, and there's a pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables. And there's very little rhyme in it, but there are some couplets and also sonnets, which we'll be going over here soon. And so here are some common Elizabethan words. And this is on page 2. It's like a dictionary there. And some of them are already filled in, but I'm going to take you through some of the ones that aren't, make sure we understand. Alas is used to express sorry, regret, compassion, or apprehension of danger or evil. I think we probably know that. This one's archaic, but they probably still use it a bit in England. I'll be there anon would just mean I'll be there soon. Art is second person are. Thou art. Only second person, though. You can't say he art or something like that. It wouldn't make any sense. And so second person are is what we should put down for that one. Like you are. Next, I. Of course, we know I, and that was used as well, or to say yes. So if you're voting at a meeting for something and you say I as opposed to nay, it means yes. And Juliet also says a few times, another use of this is I, me. And it's not like that. This just basically means like sorrow or regret, rather than just yes, like I, me. And she says that actually on the balcony in that balcony scene because she's depressed about having met Romeo and knowing that she's unable to see him. But soft is an interesting one. It just means, but wait. And Romeo says this in that same balcony scene. He says, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks. And that's what it means is wait. Dost is only second person do. Okay. So the word do doesn't necessarily change. You could say he does, and I do, and you do. So it changes a little bit nowadays, but it changes a lot more depending on what person you're in. And so you would say, thou dost, you dost, second person do. Doth is does, like when it is in third person, he does. But they would say, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. Goodeen means good evening, just a contraction. Don't use it anymore. Ere means before or until, and in the play, Juliet says, ere I again behold my Romeo. Good morrow, just means good morning. Easy way to remember that is like tomorrow. Hath is just have or had. Hence means away from here. And so if we see characters like the prince here says, go hence, he just means go away from here. Don't use the word anymore. Definitely archaic, as is hither. And Tybalt says, what dares the slave come hither? And that was just an insult toward other characters, but it means here. Hither means here. We'll get to thither a little bit farther along. A knave is like a servant or slave, and that has nothing to do with like American slavery or anything. In fact, all this is pre-slaves coming to America. It's just an insult. A knave, somebody who's like lower than you. Nay, you would imagine, means no. Ne'er, if you've heard of like a ne'er-do-well, it's like a person that never does anything right, but it's just contraction for never. O can be of. And again, just a contraction. We have lots of words like that we do that with. We cut off, and they did it as much or more than we do. O'er, I think we all know over. Oh, the river and through the woods just takes out the word or the letter V. Oft, it's also the German word for often. Quoth, not quoth, but quoth. It's kind of like quoted, and it just means said. Shout. Now, we probably know the word shall. That's a word that's becoming archaic. Very seldom do we use the word shall. But when it's second person, like thou shalt not kill. And so that's when you would use the T. Second person shall. You shalt. Thou shalt. Sometimes the is even shortened. Again, just getting rid of the letter E, and that allows it to sort of flow better with other words, I guess. Thou and thee both mean you. They're used in slightly different situations, but we're not going to get into that. It doesn't matter that much. And Romeo says, thou art far more fair than she. And that's in that same scene when he's talking about the sun. And he's saying, you are more beautiful than she. Thy and thine both have to do with possession. And so thy glory, whereas thine would be yours. This is thine. A little bit tricky, but basically just possessive forms of you. Hither was here, so thither is there. Tis. I think we know this one because it's basically, it is. Tis. But thy name that is my enemy. Just a contraction connects the two words together. Tis. Twas, we probably know, like twas the night before Christmas. It was. Another contraction. Twixt, a certain candy bar, makes this easy to remember, means between two things. And so you might say, he came twixt us, between us. Whence looks like it would be when, but of course it's not. It's where. Whence is where. This is a tough one, but usually people remember because it's so tricky. Wherefore doesn't mean where. Again, it means why. Why are you Romeo? Why do you have to be somebody that I cannot see? Whither means to where. Wilt. This isn't like a flower wilting or something. It's the second person will. Now, we don't do it anymore. You would say you will do something, but they would say thou wilt. A lot of these are second person endings are T or ST. And if you take German, you know that that's the way you conjugate verbs then. And so there are similarities because English is a Germanic language, a lot of connections to German. And so that also relates to words that you shorten the ending, like canst, hadst, shouldst, runnest. We don't add the ST anymore. So you have to shorten it, and it's just you can, or you should, or you must run. And the ST is only used in second person. And so the translations. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'll show you the first example here. And what you need to do in these activities, and we should do this right after watching the video, and you can work with other people on it. First, in the first part of activity 1, you see that I give you the Elizabethan English and you just translate it. And so there shouldn't be any words left in it that are archaic. So wherefore art thou late is why are you late? And you have to do the translation, you have to look up the dictionary, and so on. The second part of activity 1 has you do it in the opposite direction. So that's one a little harder. I give the modern translation first, and then you make it into Elizabethan English. So I'm going to jump a few slides so that you can't see all of that. We will practice this a little bit more with sonnet number 18. You don't have to do anything with that. We'll do that together. And also we'll do an activity eventually with Shakespearean insults, which is a lot of fun. And you can kind of get started on that. But I'll have to give you the link to the website and everything when we put that together. So all you really need to do is activity 1 and to go through and do all those translations. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and email me if you have any questions.